Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned, because today we're going to be doing a video about Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Every month, Roger has chosen a book for his book club that's really cheap. In fact, you can get them for free on Project Gutenberg, because every book that Roger chooses is in the public domain. So you can't get much cheaper than that. You know, free is about as cheap as you can get. So every month we read a book, and every month we'll talk about that book, except that sometimes, you know, I forget. And so this week, or this month, it's a double feature. It's Roger's Cheap Old Book Club double feature, where we're going to be talking about the June book and the July book, and then we'll talk about what we're going to be reading next month in August. Okay, so to talk about the June book, I am in the wrong outfit. Hold on. All right, my friends, now it's time to go back in time. Back to June, when it was June on the range. You know, the best time of the year, June on the range. I miss June on the range already. I already missed June on the range. But the first book I read for June on the range was for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, and that was Zane Grey's The Lone Star Ranger, the story of Buck Dwayne. Buck Dwayne, fast as lightning with a gun, and forced into becoming an outlaw. So, Buck Dwayne was an outlaw, but later he was a lawman. He went from outlaw to Texas Ranger, and this book tells that story. The Lone Star Ranger, one of Zane Grey's more popular books, and Zane Grey wrote a lot of books. He wrote a lot of them, and this was one of his more popular ones. This had a magazine version of this story that came out and was very popular, but by the time for the book publication, because normally, you know, Zane Grey would have a story, would come out in a magazine, then he would beef up the story a bit, submit it to his publishers, and they would publish a book version. But they wouldn't publish the original version of this because it was too violent, too much gunplay. Now, the original version of Lone Star Ranger is available. It's mostly from this book. This is Last of the Dwaynes. This was published by Leisure Books. And Leisure Books doesn't exist anymore, but I'm pretty sure you can still get this book. So basically, what this is it's a two-part story. The first part is when he was an outlaw. The second part is when he was a ranger. The second part of this was changed quite a bit from the original version. He actually took another story, The Lone Star Rangers, and inserted a lot of elements from that story into the second half of this book, changing a bunch of things. Probably the biggest thing they changed was the love interest. There was a woman, a young woman, who was obviously going to be the love interest of this story, but in this version she vanishes and never comes back. She just disappears, and all of a sudden, and she disappears and she's presumed dead, actually. And then he falls in love with another woman at the end of this book, in the second half, which is not what happened in this. In this, it's that original woman, you know, doesn't die or isn't presumed dead. She's the love interest of the story. But this is a lot different than that. So this was kind of Frankensteined together out of two different books, mostly Last of the Dwaynes, but a little bit of the Lone Star Rangers in the second half. So this doesn't, when you read this and you know that, you can kind of see how the first and second halves don't really jive perfectly. Zane Grey does do a good job keeping Buck Dwayne's character consistent. Not perfect. There are some things right away that you notice that are different, but Zane Grey at least tries to explain those away. Despite that, still, very entertaining. This is a very entertaining Western. It's no masterpiece, you know. It's no classic of literature, but really entertaining story. Very entertaining. So I do recommend it. If you missed this one during June on the Range, you know, like I said, all of Roger's books, they're available for free. You could pick this up for nothing and read it. And it's a really good read. It has some really exciting parts in it, some suspenseful parts. I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, The Lone Star Ranger. And now to move on to something completely different. Okay. Moving on to July. So, July's book is this one, The Last Man by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, who is famous for Frankenstein, also wrote this book, The Last Man, which is a really interesting book. It's not the most exciting book in the world, particularly in the earlier sections, but really interesting. And so I have to give it that. I had my misgivings when I began reading this, because I noticed right away that it was very melodramatic. I mean, very melodramatic. And it seemed to be taking its time about getting where it was going. However, I have to say, I was pretty invested in the story by the end of it. So this is the story of Lionel Verney, who is he's the last man. He's the last man, Lionel. And he lives in the future, at the end of the 21st century. And so, in this world that Mary Shelley envisaged, there has been no technological advances that you can really see. Everything kind of seems exactly the same as when Mary Shelley was alive. Everybody still rides horses. The one difference is that people will take hot air balloons, you know, for travel. They'll just take hot air balloons and travel from place to place that way. So that's a little different, but everything else pretty much is the same. Oh, except that England is no longer a monarchy. England has become a democracy. Recently, actually, it became a democracy by the time of this book. So Lionel Verney, he does become the last man, and this story is about a worldwide pandemic, and I suspect that is why Norton decided to make this edition. The Last Man as a novel was kind of forgotten for a long time. It got incredibly bad reviews when it was published. Not well liked at all, and so it just kind of disappeared until the 1960s, when it was rediscovered and reevaluated. And now, apparently, it's a genuine classic of literature. And I think it's because this was put together during our pandemic, which put the whole book in another light. So the pandemic in this book is serious business. It takes a while for it to show up, but once it shows up, it upends everything. And it is incredibly deadly, this pandemic. If you get it, you know, you're just gonna die. And you probably are gonna get it, because everybody does. No matter how you try to run away from it, you know, you're probably gonna get it, and you're gonna die. So very grim. And it takes a while for this to happen. It's not one of those books where the pandemic hits right away and then it's over and then you're experiencing the end of the world after the pandemic. This is different. We spend a lot of time with Lionel and his friends and family in the beginning of the book. It spends a lot of time, Mary Shelley spends a lot of time building up characters, letting you get to know these people who are in Lionel's life. And there are some interesting characters in this book. There's Adrian, the Earl of Windsor, who would have been the King of England if it hadn't become a democracy. And Adrian is based off, apparently, Apparently he's based off of Percy Shelley. And if that's true, then you can tell Mary Shelley really, really, really loved that guy. Because Adrian in this book is like the perfect man. He's perfect. He's just the perfect guy. He's great in every way. Lionel, when he first meets Adrian, just falls in love with him instantly. Ends up, marrying his sister. But you get the feeling he would have rather married Adrian because, Adrian's just that great. And then we also have Lord Raymond, who is obviously Lord Byron. And it's interesting reading about that character because, of course, Mary Shelley knew Lord Byron. And you're wondering, well, how much was Lord Byron actually like this character? She did know him, so, it makes you wonder. It's interesting. This is a very gloomy book because when things start going bad and when people start dying and civilizations start to fall, it takes a long time for this to happen. It's a gradual process, and you're with these characters every step of the way. And this novel was really ahead of its time in a lot of ways because of a lot of things that we associate with novels of this type, end of the world type of stories. A lot of those things are in this book. We have, some guy creating a cult, with a bunch of members howling about how, people deserve this and how they are the ones that are going to be saved from the plague because, they're right with the Lord and all. No. Spoiler alert, they're not. It's just a grim book. And I mean, everybody's going to die eventually. I mean, that from the title. The title is kind of the ultimate spoiler for this book. But by the time you get to the end, like I said, not the fastest pace, this book. Not the most exciting book in the world. However, I did become invested by the end of it. I was really interested and I felt for the characters as they slowly started to die off from disease or disaster. And there are some unexpected things in this book too, which I will not talk about because you might want to read it. It is worth reading. When I first started this, I wasn't sure it would be. I thought, well, maybe this is just a misfire, Maybe all of those critics back in Mary Shelley's day were right. I mean, it is an incredibly gloomy book, but that's part of its interest. Mary Shelley at this point in her life was pretty disillusioned, and she had suffered tremendous loss. All of her friends, either she lost they weren't her friends anymore, or they died, and her husband died, and her children died except for one child. And I mean, it was just, she had suffered, and she had different political ideas too at this point in her life. She was a different woman than the woman who had written Frankenstein. And this is a much different book. It is worth reading though. And like I said, I didn't know that it would be. So, yeah, I ended up liking The Last Man. I have some reservations about recommending it to everybody. It is a challenging book. So, know that going in. But, if you're interested in Mary Shelley, for sure, this is kind of a must-read, I think. So, there's that. The Last Man. So, next month, August, we have a really cool book coming up in August. In August, we're going to be reading this, Gladiator by Philip Wiley. So there are a bunch of different paperback editions of this floating around out there. And again, you can get this on Project Gutenberg, or you can get it either cheap or free in a bunch of other places. I have, like I said, this paperback copy of Gladiator. This was a novel written in 1930, which had a great influence on the creation of the character Superman. Because this is about a guy who develops superpowers, who has superpowers. So it's a superhero story, but not the kind that we would be familiar with, I believe. The plot to this is quite different than what we would normally associate with superheroes, because basically when this book was written, there were no superheroes. So it's going to be an interesting read. It's, like I said, this is a highly influential novel. And I've never read it, so there you go. Gladiator by Philip Wiley. You can get it for free. So join me in August. Join Roger and me in August for Philip Wiley's Gladiator, the next exciting book. And this one I think actually will be more exciting than the last one. The next exciting book in Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.